turn it
off. I'll pause it.
All right. Let me share my screen here a second. Let me know when you can see it, if you can see it properly. Yes.
We can see it.
All right. So you should see a wonderful picture of a scene from Rio with a favela in the background and some rather nice hotels. So anyway, thanks Angie and everyone else for letting us take a few minutes to explain what we are doing, which we're obviously quite excited about. And I would have gladly had Amy tell you all about it, but she decided to go and get a new knee over the last few weeks. And so I'm going to embarrass her like hell now. But anyway, so she's totally pumped full of pharmaceuticals. And so she may say really strange things. So we're going to avoid that, and you're stuck with me. Place, oh, it is doing funny things. All right, so place, this idea, and we chose place very carefully because I think we believe that everything is so interconnected now going forward that to pull on just one lever within the human experience is probably not good, and we need to look at a way that it all comes together. And this idea of place really resonated with us, and it because it's both tangible and intangible. The way we describe place through a very precise definition or a measurement, a location, but also the intangible sense of place that we all gain in different ways through our experience with people who live near us, and coffee shops we go to, and where we can walk, and all these wonderful things all give us this really important sense of identity and belonging. And I think COVID has probably exposed a sense of place even more than we had before. I certainly know it has for me. My sense of place has shrunk considerably over the last year, as I haven't traveled in the way that I usually would. And so it's become hyper local for me. Which has been interesting. So what are we? We're a non-profit data trust that serves the public interest. And our goal is to create and maintain accurate and timely data about the place around us and to make it available to as many people as possible. So why do we think place matters? Well, actually, it turns out that large portions of the Earth's surface are actually not mapped and haven't been mapped in some time. And despite Google Earth, this is still true. Governments have traditionally been the providers of mapping data. And if you live in England and Wales, you have the wonderful Ordnance Survey that produces all this great stuff. If you're in the US, you have USGS and Forest Service and others who provide good data. And you have your local county government that for the most part is probably producing quite good public data. But for the most part, in most places, if we just take sub-Saharan Africa, none of those countries have comprehensively mapped their country since the colonial times, since the British overseas mapping agencies were involved. So if you're in Ghana, it's 1952 was the last time that you comprehensively mapped the country. And of course, it's changing drastically. And the pace of change is accelerating even faster. So commercial entities have stepped in, and the obvious platforms have come in, Google, Facebook, and the like. The problem they're not producing in the public interest. They have uneven coverage as a result. Their interest is commercial. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're not working in the public interest. And while they produce fantastic products, their whole model is, of course, how do I tune delivering advertising to you in ever more targeted ways? And your location data, your both personal and what's around you, becomes a means to that end. So they don't really service in the public interest. And crowdsourcing and OpenStreetMap has obviously gotten a lot of coverage, but it is based on a volunteer model and a consensus governance model that can work well in post-disaster environments, but typically has not created consistent quality data across geographies. And as a result of all of these things, and because of a lack of consistent funding, we have a complete market failure. And so it was into this space that we wanted to step and say, can we create a model that solves for this public market failure, and in a way that can realize the public interest at the same time. So our goal is to be a sustainable nonprofit business that doesn't compete with our members. The classic economist description of a club good, that is a non-rivalrous, excludable to some degree, good. And we put ourselves at that place, sort of in between public goods and club goods there in that graphic. And so our job is to play an essential but very small role in the middle, securing a technology warehouse that provides access, pays local organizations to collect the data according to the specification that we set. So we are creating jobs. Ultimately leverage loan financing that we use to on contract in country, set the standards and pricing, and provide commercial access, which is ultimately, along with some membership fees, how we get to financial sustainability. Now, and our impact is, I won't go through these, and I'm happy to share this deck afterwards. How we think about how we have scale. This is the kind of data that we collect. So we go out and collect very high detailed aerial data for cities mostly, but other key areas, land use and land cover, hydrology, the other big money maker, which is point of interest, and then transportation and built environment. And we recently completed a quick test just before Christmas during COVID. Here's one of the mapping platforms. You can see it's a mini plane that flies very high resolution data and allows us quickly, in a matter of a day, to upload this data and process it and make it available. And if we have time and interest, we can actually show you a demo of what that looks in real time. So all of that is to get to this sort of key slide for this group, and I think hopefully where the meat of the conversation is, which is, and I think Stefaan, yes, Stefan's on the call as well, and we've enlisted the help of GovLab to help us work with the community to construct the governance model for this data trust. So you've understood the type of data and why the type of data is coming in, the kind of club membership model. But it's essential that as a first principle, we establish trust, and that the data is held in trust in the public interest, but is structured in a way that allows good governance, participation and representation of each of the members, but allows us as an entity that has to be financially sustainable and has to create commercial grade data, the ability to move managerially in a way that allows us to service commercial expectations. And so there is a natural tension between management prerogative and ensuring that we have participation and representation of our members. And that's something we're working through with Stefaan, and would very much invite this group to give us thoughts and feedback and input. And then something Stefaan's also helping us with is, how do we think about a governance structure that has an independent board of trustees that is the only authority that can ensure that we stay on mission and that the data is stewarded and can't be sold in its entirety, for example, to say a Google. And how do we balance those key elements of governance at the trustee level with the board and advisory board and the working committees of the place management entity, the nonprofit. And so what is the relationship between the Board of Trustees around the stewardship needs and the operational needs? And again, this is not baked. This is something that we're working on live now, real, to get in place as version 1 as we begin to operate. This is sort of the hourglass, or it's tilted on its side, obviously, but this is the idea that we create value and scale by accessing this financing, getting it out the door, local jobs, data produced, innovation happens, we collect the revenue for the payment of this use. So we sit at the center, we borrow long-term concessional finance to make this happen. As a nonprofit, we only have to meet our operating obligations, which include servicing the loan. It's specifically why we did not set up as a for-profit and take venture funding, because our belief is if we do that, we will be forced to compete by adding value to our base product. And that's not the goal. Our goal is to create the plumbing that everybody else needs, but no one else really wants to compete to build. But we have to absolutely ensure that at every level we engender trust and engage our membership in this process. And of course, the idea is that our members are the ones who then deliver a good place, but they have 2 ways that they pay fees. So the club is open to everybody, but you have to be a member. So you pay a membership fee that might range from $500 a year to $100,000 if you're the World Bank. And that binds you to standard behavior, terms and conditions, and also gives us a governance environment to deal with non-compliance or bad behavior, including kicking someone out of the club. And then if you're in the club, you have the choice of paying commercial fees to use the data for commercial gain with no royalty requirements or no share alike requirements, or you could choose an ODBL style license, which means you don't have to pay for fees of using the data, but there is a requirement to share back whatever value you create through your use of the place data. And then finally, is the idea that we are really a B2B, if you will, or we enable others who have the direct connection and the direct impact in the field and are working on everything from agriculture to land rights to health to education, etc. All of whom need this core fundamental data. So that's it in terms of any formal presentation. Let me stop, and Amy and I would be happy to answer any questions, but also really engage with this team. And for anyone who's interested in engaging even more, would welcome you to join Stefan's list as we move forward on the governance side of things. So thanks very much, and happy to open it up. And let me make sure I can unshare so we get everything back.
This is Angie. I know that it's hard to see chat while you're sharing and stuff. So Greg had posted in the chat window, how does this compare with OpenStreetMap? And I think he was talking specifically about the conversation about geopositioning, I think is where that question arose.
Yeah, so we're quite a bit different from OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap, first of all, OpenStreetMap depends on other sources of data in order to map. It's also a volunteer-based model, and it's also a model that is entirely based on consensus governance. And as such, they are not able to raise funding. They do not look to pay organizations, and they are not able to enforce consistent standards of collection. They do wonderful stuff, don't get me wrong, and we see them as a potential partner. But they really don't have a scalable model to be able to build these fundamental layers. Similar in some ways, but quite different in others. I don't know if I've turned off sharing.
It's okay. I have no, oh, no, you have not. So I
Yeah.
can read you the chat questions really easily because your slides, I think people are asking questions based on those. So
Yeah, no, definitely. And I've lost the ability to, let me flip to.
I might be able to take care of it. Let me give you the question. There's actually a couple people asking, just to clarify, members are beneficiaries of the trust?
So members are able to access the data and use the data, and members are also able to be part of working committees, as well as potentially have engagement in governance. So the idea that we're still working through is how does the trust work in terms of so the idea is that the data, there we go, okay, it's back. The data, quote, belongs to the trust. However, that is constructed, and we haven't constructed the trust yet, whether in legal terms or others. So if you leave the membership, the idea is that you would not be able to access the data, and you would not be a, quote, part owner of the data trust. So you must be an active member of the trust in order to participate and benefit from the data. And I think I can see the chats now.
I had one, so I think it dovetails. So Greg has a second question, but I want to answer what I think is probably a fundamental question that Kim is asking. How does the advisory board work? And then I have a comment that I think, but orient everyone. How does your advisory board, in your head at least, work?
Well, so we have an advisory board. There's about 20 members. They represent different sectors. Right now, it's strategic as well as ongoing, and they have a non-fiduciary role, and they provide us technical feedback, expertise in different areas. So we have humanitarian organizations represented, we have government organizations represented, and they're giving us their perspectives and thoughts on this, and the types of specifications they want to see in the data, and the type of data elements that they would like to see that would be helpful. So at the moment, that's how the advisory board is working, but it's non-fiduciary. And we also do that so that we can get government officials or World Bank. So we have 2 World Bank people on as well. And it's a very light lift for them to get approval to be associated with something like this. Whereas if they sit on the board, that is, it's a very lengthy, very drawn out process for government and say World Bank officials to sit on the board. So strategically, it allows us to get representation from those organizations, but without any sort of liability issues. Just to Greg's point, so OSM has scaled in some ways impressively over 20 plus years, but it has not been able to solve the problem of incomplete, inconsistent data. So if you look at Ghana, for example, it has not scaled at all. If you look at cafe style mapping in Europe and other places, it has. And even where the data does exist, if you really interrogate the data, it quickly doesn't become useful for commercial use, for analysis, and relying on things. And so it's very much hit or miss what you get as a guide and as a visual data set. It's great, and it can give you some orientation. But and if you are involved in OSM, it is absolutely riven with and has not found a way to deal with deeply misogynistic behavior and aggressive behavior towards anyone who doesn't look like by the self-perceived authorities, which typically tend to be middle-aged white males. And we know this because we looked hard at funding OSM to see if we could help them get to scale and resolve some of the governance issues. And it's an ongoing battle for OSM. So, and also they have no ability to collect drone imagery. And without the imagery, OSM has to rely on commercial satellite providers, allowing them access, and that can be turned off at any moment. And if that is turned off, OSM will find it extremely hard to do its work. And so I think it's very important that we control more of the means of production by working in partnership with government to fly this high resolution data. Yeah, and Neil, yeah, good to see, Greg, that you see these troubles, and having talked to a number of the female mappers who actually have to hide behind male avatars because of the way they're trolled, it's really, and that's not good for us. It's not a good environment. It's not scalable, and that's problematic. So yeah, Neil, on your question, our whole goal is not to step on toes of people who might be authoritative. So we don't want to go and say who owns a building, or what the building is valued at, or where the administrative boundary is. We don't want to collect personally identifiable information. The goal is to map that which is observable from the street or from the air, whether by satellites or plane, so that we would say there's a building here, it's this big, it's 2 stories, it's made of this material, and it's on the corner of these 2 streets. So it's this idea that we would be network rail to all the rail companies, manage the shared common infrastructure, or build and manage it, which is the stations, the bridges, the signals, and the rails, that it doesn't make sense for others to try and fragment it, manage that for bits of Britain. It's the same with the data. Just do the observable fundamental infrastructure level data, and allow others to use their limited budget and time to go and do the value add data, which would be, say, authoritative data, or if you're a NGO that's working in the health space, instead of having to go and gather where all the households are that you want to service, you can actually now get on with becoming more targeted about when and where you're going to deliver your vaccines.
Thank you. On the network rail analogy, of course, the railways were built by other people, weren't they? And then they're sort of managed by Network Rail. And that creates, I think, particular difficulties around the incentives to maintain infrastructure. I'm not sure it's, in the UK, seen as a very successful example. It's just the way they've set it up. But I was wondering, something I'm very curious about, and I don't know the details of these, but a historical precedent for these things is, I think, water corporations and these sort of things in civic areas going back to Victorian times, they seem, and I don't know the details, I'd love to know more about this, they seem to have been set up by sort of business leaders who recognized the need for better infrastructure locally and were prepared to invest time in building that infrastructure because they understood it was for the common good. But I don't know how they were sort of governed. And of course, they then ended up being merged into regional water authorities and then privatized. But my understanding is that they were always initially set up in manners that align with what you're saying, which would kind of make sense given the, I guess, a water infrastructure would have been the equivalent of a data infrastructure today.
Well, I think you've hit on one of the points, which is this is infrastructure. This is data infrastructure. And it doesn't make sense, for multiple organizations to try and collect the same data. The Dutch have a term, they call it pre-competition corporation. And they have a history of this. Ideal being one of the more recent ones, which is the payment system that ABN, Rabobank, and ING set up, because they recognized the need for a shared electronic platform for payments. And it is now handling most of the transactions, digital transactions, actually in the Netherlands, at a much lower cost than were they to use some other switching platform from a third party, or even a Visa or MasterCard. So yeah, and we want to draw on those examples, I think, Neil, but that's kind of, I think, where it is more of a utility, more of an infrastructure type of realm, I think, that we're headed into.
So yeah, just to I guess to close that off, I guess the tension I I think is interesting is there's a tension between the standardization that you're implying with the payment system and an ability to innovate and create new things. And I guess that's the thing I'm really curious about in your case, how you manage that tension within a single organization, because there will be a desire for standards and some kind of consistency. I mean, in some sense, the same problems you're mentioning coming up in OpenStreetMap. How are you going to represent certain entities at one level, but then at another level, there's going to be people who want to try sort of innovative and creative things. And when you have one government structure, it feels hard to sort of span those two. You end up sort of, it's like, it's one of these things where moving at the speed of the slowest wagon or something like that, isn't it? It's super, super difficult, particularly in where the data is emerging and coming in, and you're going to be finding out that governments are wanting to use it in different ways. And I think that feels like a real tension. Probably you've thought a lot about this.
No, yeah, I think I see the tension slightly differently. I think the lesson that we spent a lot of time learning from was Aadhaar in India, the national ID system, and talking to the team that put that together. They only collect 5 elements of data. And the team was very clear and very specific that they were going to collect the very minimum amount of data to allow innovation to happen above that data, but also not to step on the toes. So if they were asked, and we've already had this challenge, they were asked, would you collect some education information about the people when you collect their biometrics? Would you collect some health information? And they said, no, absolutely not. And they said, but that's deeply inefficient. Surely you could quickly do that and it would be fantastic. And the answer was no, because the health guys and the education guys will be all over us and say, you're now playing in our space, we're going to shut you down. And instead, they act as this core switch that unlocks the Ministry of Health. And the discipline and I think the tension for us is to absolutely be focused on core basic data and nothing else. So we don't step on toes, we're not rivalrous, and we allow others to innovate on top of us. So we create this ecosystem of insights and models, and people can go and make money and do whatever they want. So I think that's the tension, because we've already been asked, oh, this is fantastic. I've got all these stranded data assets. Can we chuck them at you and you store them? And we're saying no at the moment, because it's just the amount of work that has to go into quantifying the data, quality control, scrubbing it, processing it, what's the provenance, and then saying, well, here it is, and by the way, it's for this little piece of geography at this little piece of time. So we do not want to become the boneyard, if you will, of all these other data sets. Certainly not right away. I think maybe if we get scale and we're doing complete geographies and it becomes a public utility to be a sort of a library of assets, then we might do it. But the tension and people aren't always happy when we say no to taking these stranded assets.
Sorry, just because I'm not seeing any questions in the talk. If anyone else wants to come in, but you're triggering different thoughts. And another thought was that all of a sudden I've switched to thinking of you more like a sort of credit reference agency in terms of some of the things you're describing. So in terms of the way a credit reference agency works, they are operators, brokers between different banks where data can come together, and there's somehow a uniform interface to that, so the government can use them for ID verification. I think that there's a lot of questions about how well they are set up. Like Experian is a massive one, and how they look to make money. I'm not saying that one should mimic that, but the gist of what you were saying was a little bit like that, but for GIS data in some sense, that there's a minimum level of things you do, but you're actually interacting, but you become a place where, I don't know if these are the members, are interacting in order to maintain some standards and unity around that data so it's more useful, but maybe I've misunderstood.
No, I think I would say we're slightly different from the data unions, because they sort of, to some degree, prey on everyone's individual data and then try and aggregate it. What we're looking to do is, there are two ecosystems that we're trying to create. The ecosystem on top, which we've talked about, you know, the people that can use the data for commercial or non-commercial gain, and they get on and do their thing, and we enable them. There's also the ecosystem, the other half of the hourglass below us, where the money we raise, most of it actually goes out the door to contract organizations and companies to go and collect the data according to the spec that the membership has agreed on. So we're stewarding the members and saying, what's the best technical spec for the imagery we're collecting or the point of interest data? And then we actually contract local organizations and pay them to go and do the work, which is another big difference between us and say an OSM, because we're very keen to get local capacity going. And they then collect that data. We just do QA, QC on it, and then store it centrally in a big bucket that all the members have access to.
You do have a question here from Jessica. I prompted people to, I appreciate
Just saw it,
might be
yeah.
your lunch hour in some places. So, you know, if you have a noisy environment, maybe you don't want to. So Jessica says, we touched briefly last session on how the ideas around fiduciary duties vary across jurisdictions or contexts. What do you see the scope of these duties as being?
Yeah. So governments are going to be very important partners for us, right? And our idea is that we have to span geographies. This model works only when there are multiple geographies involved, which is something we can leverage an individual government can't. An individual government, Ghana, for example, is not that interested in collecting data for Sierra Leone or Liberia. A commercial entity is not really just interested in buying data about Ghana. They want to buy multiple geographies. So the platform allows us to kind of service their needs. But there's real tension there. And I think our challenge is going to be non-cooperative governments that for security reasons or under the guise of security reasons say, if I'm Rwanda, I don't want Malawi to see my data. And how do we deal with that? At one level, that's nonsensical because, of course, Malawi can get other types of data for a one-off if they want to, but how do we honor the government's requests? And do you standardize it? Do we lose commercial benefit if we have differing levels of engagement in that? And to what degree can a government actually really be represented? We're not going to be a UN level organization, that's clear. So without that, can the government even, and will it agree to a fiduciary charge at some level or point? It may not. And so how do we, and that's a question for Stefaan and our team, how do we think about the engagement of government? How do we think about sovereignty of data? And where do we park this thing? Because I'm pretty sure that as we get going, people are not going to feel entirely confident about it sitting in the US, for example, which is currently where it is. So should we look at another jurisdiction? And what's the relationship between those governments and that jurisdiction? So, I mean, these are good questions, and a lot of them we're just getting going on. But Stefaan, I see you've flipped on your camera, so I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks to everyone here. And I just want to add a few elements, Peter, if that's okay. And more importantly, meaning I mainly want to abuse this group to tap into the wisdom, and so I'm not gonna. Anyway, there is no one way of doing this, and so eager to hear from this group on what can we learn from other, especially Ostrom approaches to how to deal with some of those tensions. And so the first one is coming back to what Peter ended, which is the challenge of what I call the challenge of a social license to do what Place seeks to do, that gets that kind of mandate to actually manage that resource in a way that is deemed to be in the public interest. And I think it would be interesting if anyone has some pointers to how other organizations that clearly didn't receive that mandate from, for instance, the UN, but acquired that social license and as a result became legitimate players. Would be interesting to see whether anyone has some examples. Now, one way to get a social license is, of course, to also structure yourself in a way that you acquire legitimacy. And so it would be interesting to hear whether anyone has some suggestions. Typically, here at GovLab, we focus on the so-called 4 horsemen. And again, that might be out of date on how we talk about it when it comes to legitimacy, i.e. Accountability, transparency, participation, representation, right? And how do you build that in the structure so that by having those, you acquire some legitimacy, which then, where Peter started, quite often conflicts with the other key objective, which is efficiency and effectiveness, right? And how do you manage to be inclusive, but at the same time still make decisions, especially given the way it is being set up. So that's my second reflection. And then, and to get, anyway, some ammunition, hopefully to have people react on how to go about this. But the last thing I want to add to Peter's great presentation here is that what I'm very interested in Place is that Place, unlike other kind of data collaboratives, and we've done a lot of studies of data collaboration in a variety of sectors and countries, I think Place really focuses on how do you establish this kind of data collaboration or data trust in a systematic, but also, more importantly, sustainable manner. And that's then the other element that I like to get the Ostrom experts here to reflect on, which is, of course, sometimes linked with this notion of the tragedy of the commons, which is how do we build this in a manner that is sustainable, right? And I think Place has really done tremendous advances in that thinking. But then at the same time, how do we do this in a responsible way, i.e. responsible to other interests and in some cases other rights, of course, as well. And so just to, anyway, set this within perhaps some of the elements that you all have worked on.
Yeah, and I think the other key difference is that we're not looking to aggregate others' data that exists or is in pockets. We're actually going out and collecting at spec consistent data across broad geographies and then making that available. So that's much more of an operational bent than a coordination bent, and moves us away from the collaborative, as Stefaan says, to more of this real operational sustainable bent, because we're actually collecting this data. But we don't want to own it as Amy and Peter. We don't think that's responsible, but we don't want to just throw it wide open to the public space because there are legitimate reasons for not doing that, including sustainability. So how do we create a governance mechanism that people trust, that the data they believe is held in trust and owned therefore by everyone and no one, but can still be managed? So it's always, and again, it's all back to Eleanor in so many ways, but in this really interesting way.
So so let me say a couple of things. First, I'm very interested in this, the governance model of how we manage these, or the whole governance model, I guess. And so I'm at Ostrom, so I'm also interested in the community. So I'm being a little bit quiet. I will say on purpose, I will say one of the things that I toyed with for a while was, and this is going to be, again, a dated, one parts of this will be a dated phrase, but I toyed with for a while, not just, I agree, consensus is a difficult process to, especially as we grow. You get governments who have different, or its own sovereign, I toyed with something that is actually come up a couple times in a different space. But I'm prefacing it with, I'm not convinced this is right or wrong. I just throw it out there. That the community sets rules for, and creates a structure that manages conflict and has as its sole purpose the management and the enforcement of rules amongst this community. So that's the conflict space, right? In my opinion, through the idea of what I've titled, and this is not my phrase. I can't remember. I think Sean actually came up with it. If Greg wants to pop in and say, because I don't think Sean's on here, the phrase benevolent dictator. Now, first of all, dictator is probably the wrong word, but as soon as you say it, doesn't matter what community you're in, everybody gets the idea. And so so this individual is given, or maybe a small group, is given very specific rules, very specific mandates, and has no personal skin in the game. But their job is to be the conflict organizer, the rule enforcer, the grand negotiator, and the community itself can attack not the dictator status, but instead the benevolence. And you intentionally leave the phrase, or the word benevolent wide open, as the same way that lawyers use reasonable, quite honestly. So you attack the benevolence. You're able to say as a community, I believe you're behaving in a way that is not benevolent to the entire community. Now we all need to become involved. And then there's this mechanism. Again, I'm not convinced it's right, but the reason it came up was in a more of a cybersecurity context. And I think people know that, Ostrom is now walking several lines. And we were just constantly being told, look, you need to understand, sometimes we don't have time. And people, for various reasons, reject the cybersecurity updates, reactions, all kinds of stuff. And we don't have time. Sometimes we just have to take action to protect, the infrastructure. And so it came out of some of that literature of just understanding that there are certain things that sometimes someone has to act or has to stop someone else from acting. I still don't like the word dictator. I think it totally miscaptures what it is that I'm talking about, but it does transcend, it sort of bridges all the different silos that we do. The structure for how you can then get involved with attacking the benevolence and stuff was interesting. And we became really concerned that what you would have is something that you were talking about earlier, Peter, are sort of these, small but growing voiced communities that use that ability to attack that in ways that are just fundamentally wrong to who we ever want to be as a society, quite frankly. And that was the point that I thought, oh, now that's interesting. Crud. Crud. So I just throw that out there. Yeah, it's data steward. It's a very American concept, but I really try not to use some of those terms. Mostly because they already have meaning, right? So the data steward, is brilliant. Europe is obviously really involved in the data steward idea as well. And I support it. It works really, really well. But it's taken on meaning. And unfortunately in our case, so I'm an IU, we have questions about whether or not the data stewards are actually, how they're making decisions. There's sort of these times that you're like, what? And right now, at least for us, the data steward has, at least for us, IU, has sort of become more about law and compliance, right? Oh, the HIPAA says, or this says, and I'm like, yeah, I think I want you to do more than this. I don't think I need you to tell me the law is gray on this area. And so, I need some standards and stuff. So I will say thank you, Greg. That is sort of why but I got to get rid of, I think it's a benevolent decision maker. Probably, but that's too nebulous as well. But that's the idea behind it. And I just wonder how that fits with what you're thinking, Peter. And, the problem with it, or some of the pushback immediately on it, is you need a whole lot of rules and a whole lot of boundaries. And the community itself has to give those rules to the decision maker. You have to sort of outsource some power. And as soon as I say that, that should remind you of, the US structure, right? I mean, this is sort of what we're built on. The idea of the states gave power, right? And then retain power in some places. So then I get immediate pushback on, congratulations for understanding the American system really well, broaden your horizons, which I think is fair, absolutely fair pushback. And then I'll do a quick comment, Peter. I'm surprised how many people are still, hey, we'll put it in the US. I'm like, dear Lord, don't put data in the US. And I just had that conversation at APEC on a particular project they're doing, and they're trying to get states to, we're aggregating data to just sort of count numbers. And nobody pushed back. And I'm like, yeah, you must have not talked to all the economies then, because no, you actually talk to the economies, not the people in the room. There are data standards that the US simply does not live up to. And I would be surprised if they're going to, share certain data points into a US, we'll just go quagmire. I don't know how else to say it. So I see that no one else is jumping in. So again, I hate to, and we're running out of time. So, hey, here's a PhD level essay question for you, Peter. But what are your thoughts on both of those? Not the second point, US, fine, but about that idea of a small entity being nimble enough with some bounds to be able to help take actions in the areas that you're struggling with right now.
Yeah, I mean, these are all absolutely valid. And this is why we said, Stefan, help us, because what we didn't want to do is cook something and then impose it on people.
Right.
Right. So this is the beginning of that journey now of how do we engage a broader community to help us come up with some of those initial bounds, understanding this will always be a work in progress for tuning, as long as we have a good mechanism for tuning. And so now it's sort of literature review, looking for other examples. We touched on one, Neil, that is probably appropriate intellectually, but not operationally, which is Network Rail Track, and that whole fiasco. But others, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, they're probably more around the utility environment. I think we have an advantage in that we're not collecting personally identifiable information. We're collecting information about the Earth's surface and what's going on. And there is the bounding treaty of the Treaty of UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Commission Law of the Sea, which actually underpins outer space treaties, and the Outer Space Treaty, which defines the right of others to collect imagery about other countries and how they make it available. So there are some structures and frameworks that I think we can hang on that are already internationally recognized. And certainly, I think we looked also, funnily enough, at the Bosch company and the Bosch Family Foundation and their stewardship model, which has been around for 100 years plus, which is very much sort of de rigueur among social businesses that are looking to get out of or get rid of their equity investors and move towards more of a steward model. So I think we'll take a look there. But in some ways, we're asking for help, and we are abusing this group's intellect as well in saying these are all, critical questions. I see that Sadia had a question. The metadata is absolutely standardized. What's really interesting is there is no agreed definition of what a primary data set is. If you go to the UN, they have one definition, the EU has another, the UK has another. And then if you talk about what layers are considered primary layers, the UN has 14, the EU has 32, so on and so forth. We're actually down to 5 or 6. There is a commercial discipline that ultimately helps you get away from almost an intellectual non-ending dialogue when there's a top-down sort of, here's what's good for us to use. Jack Dangerman, who's the founder and president of ESRI, the largest mapping company in the world, always told me, hey, Peter, standards ship in volumes. And what he meant by that was, I set a standard for an open format called shapefile. It's now the standard because I dominate the market space and everyone just uses it as a convenience. So what we're trying to do is strip down to its essence all of these frameworks and definitions of metadata and so on. And it's actually relatively easy to come down with a simplified metadata, that is data about data. So what data do I have? What attributes does it have? If I have a business, how do I describe the business? Is it commercial? Is it not, etc. And then what ends up happening is that countries can put any specific elements on top themselves. So if they have a local name for a market stall, they can add their market name. I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't do that. And so I don't mean to be flip, but the answer to all of the differences is to not manage for the difference, right? Which is very much a kind of top-down academic approach to solve for everyone. If you've come out of business, you know you don't solve for the edge cases.
Right. Well, I wonder, I don't really know the history well enough, but that's very much what the ICC does, right? The Incoterms. I mean, there's tons of these things that are like, you're crazy enough not to use them, fine, but here's a standard and everyone else is using them. Make up your own FOB. So there are examples, and yeah, I think I do like that idea. They're struggling with this in the blockchain, right? Which I hate to, blockchain bingo. But they're struggling with this in the blockchain. And the bad part about, in my opinion, the blockchain, that the governance conversation and standards and stuff, is they let the horse take off running out of the barn. And then everyone went, oops, we should have worried about interoperability and stuff. And everybody's like, yeah, probably. You mean you should use the word the same way in different places and stuff. So the nice part about this is I think you're at least on the front edge of this. Right? No one can point to this massive, example of this in large quantities that's been scaled and replicated. So I will say that, if yeah, those are my 2 cents. Does anyone else have a couple of sort of parting comments? And because we are officially out of time, and I really work very hard to keep us on time, or at least to do the best I can so we end the official conversation, and then I'm always happy to hang out and chat more. But I know some people are needing potentially to leave, and I don't want to exclude you from asking questions if you have anything.
Oh, that was very informative.
So let me thank Peter and Amy, who's on here, I think. So, but certainly a massive co-collaborator with Peter. But thank you very much, Peter. This will, again, be part of a larger library, I hope, that we gather over time. And quite honestly, I hope in a very short amount of time, 5 years, we look back on some of these videos and go, that's hilarious. Just like we look back on, Amazon one-click and can't imagine our lives not existing in that context. But when that first happened, it was sort of magic for a lot of us. And so I hope in very short time, we're able to pick off at least a few.
No, and again, we're a live use case, and we'd love to be used as a use case, and would love input. So I know Stefan stuck in the chat. Yeah. As he gets rolling on this, help us shape this. And if hopefully you find it as exciting as we do to say, hey, this is actually something that's being operationalized, and we get a chance to dig in on that. We'd welcome everyone and anyone.
So thank you for that. I will, as the videos start going up, I will also populate that with, assuming with permission, the contact details and stuff. So so people don't have to, panic. I'm going to officially end the recording now, again, with thanking Kim, Peter, and Amy for this session. Don't forget, these are on the third Thursday, sort of we're trying to keep it at a consistent time. So you can just sort of grab a sandwich or a coffee and join us. And we hope you're finding these informative. I look forward to next time.
Super.